Hi, I'm Clyde Haberman. Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. I'm filling in for Sam Roberts. In the United States, the percentage of workers in unions has been steadily on a decline for decades now. So it came as a surprise when workers at the Amazon Fulfillment Center on Staten Island voted to unionize by a margin of more than 500 votes. While Amazon will certainly fight the result in court, it was still a notable victory against the company with one of the greatest number of global workers. Starbucks is another high-profile company where workers have voted to unionize. As it stands now, 7 stores are union shops, and workers at more than 100 others have filed for union elections. Over the pandemic, the number of workers on strike has increased as workers recognize their power and are bargaining for better conditions and compensation. Stephen Greenhouse was long a labor reporter for the Times, is now a contributing writer. Welcome, Steve. But before we talk, I do want to take note of 2 very important news stories locally this week. One is the subway shootings and the capture of a suspect in that. The other is the basically forced resignation of Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin after he faced corruption charges. The impact on New York politics will be very important. And I have no doubt that Governor Kathy Hochul will come in for a lot of accusations about her judgment in picking Mr. Benjamin as her deputy. But we'll leave that for another day. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Very nice to be here.
The votes at Starbucks and Amazon, can you, in terms of where labor stands overall these days, how significant are these developments?
I think they're very significant, Clyde. I've been writing about labor for 25 years. And, to my mind, the unionization victory against Amazon Staten Island is the biggest beat the odds union victory, I've ever seen by far. Amazon is this hugely powerful company. It's like the symbol of commerce in the 21st century. It's a fiercely, ferociously anti-union company. And it was, to my mind, fairly amazing that this new upstart union that was founded by a fired worker and his best friend, a fellow Amazon worker, beat this mammoth company in a warehouse with 8,300 workers. That's, it's one thing. It's hard enough to win a unionization at a Starbucks when Starbucks is also very anti-union, where that is 25 employees, so you just need 13 of the 25 to vote for a union. But to get a majority of 8,300 workers, that's something. And the victories at these 2 very well-known and also very anti-union companies, I think, are inspiring many workers across the US. They're thinking, wow, if you could unionize at these prominent anti-union companies, then we have a shot unionizing perhaps at Walmart or Target or Home Depot or Staples.
Why is it difficult to unionize at Starbucks or Amazon? Surely wages are not what a lot of the workers would want. Imagine working conditions are the same. What makes those companies so difficult for unions?
So one of the crazy things I've written about, Clyde, is that there are polls showing that 1 in 2 American non-union workers say they'd like to join a union if they can. But only 1 in 10 workers overall are in unions, and just 1 in 16 in the private sector. And the greatest opposition to unions is in the private sector. So one thing that makes it really tilts the playing field against unions when they seek to unionize a place. Take Amazon, and we've seen this at the failed effort, the struggling effort to unionize an Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama. Amazon has access to the workers, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It could show anti-union videos in the break rooms and lunchrooms. Managers can go up to buttonhole to speak to the workers one-on-one, to urge them, to pressure them to vote against the union. And it has these so-called captive audience meetings, these mandatory meetings, that employees have to attend, where anti-union consultants hold forth about the supposed evils of unions. So companies really can propagandize more or less nonstop, in addition to sending text messages and advertising on Facebook and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, unions, under American law, companies have the right, the power to totally prohibit union organizers from setting foot on company property. Can't even put flyers on the windshields of cars in the parking lot. So there's a real imbalance in how much employers can communicate and how much unions can communicate. So I think that really creates this imbalance. And second, another thing that really fuels this imbalance is, corporations have a lot of power over workers. They could, scare you. They could maybe threaten that, something bad will happen to your operation, to your plant, to your factory if you unionize. And oftentimes companies fire the rank and file workers who lead the organizing drives. And if they do that, and it's illegal to retaliate against workers for supporting a union, under federal law, the companies can't be fined. The most that can happen is they can be required to post a notice saying, we broke the law, we're naughty, we won't do it again, and pay the back pay, for the months that the fired workers were out of a job. So there is this imbalance, and what's changing now, I think coming out of the pandemic, many workers, they are considered heroes. They are hailed as essential workers, and yet, they felt that their employers often didn't do nearly enough to protect them against COVID. They feel they were often forced to work lots and lots of overtime. And many of them, saw CEO pay going up 20, 30, 40% during the pandemic, yet many companies refused to, give them so-called hero pay or hazard pay. So a lot of workers coming out of the pandemic are really, pardon my French, pissed off. And they see unions as a way to help lift them. I think that's exactly what we're seeing at Amazon and exactly what we're seeing at Starbucks. And at Starbucks, what's happened the past few days is pretty remarkable. There was a vote yesterday in Eugene, Oregon, 17-0 for the union. A vote yesterday in Pittsburgh at a Starbucks, 20-0 for the union. At two Boston area Starbucks, the vote this week were 25-0 for the union. So there's this upsurge of support for unions.
Starbucks and Amazon have obviously gotten the lion's share of attention. Are there other developments in labor management relations that we should be keeping an eye on, that you're keeping an eye on?
Sure. So REI is a well-known, much like Progressive company, the first REI store in the nation unionized in Manhattan. At our employer, the New York Times, former employer of the New York Times, 600 tech workers, software workers, just voted to unionize. They formed the largest tech union in the United States. At the Art Institute of Chicago and many other museums, workers have voted to unionize. We're seeing for the first time undergraduate workers at Dartmouth and Wesleyan and Grinnell and Kenyon. They're forming unions. We're seeing gazillions of grad student workers and journalists unionizing. So especially among educated workers, there's a sense that we're not being treated well enough at work. We're not being paid what we deserve. And there's, again, this embrace of unions. And the big question, and as you said in the opening, Clyde, decade after decade, year after year, the percentage of workers in unions has declined. And the question is, with this increased popularity of unions, with all these young workers embracing unions, might that finally, after decades and decades of decline, reverse labor's decline? And might we start seeing an increase of the number of union members overall in the United States?
What are those numbers? I confess I'm not quite familiar, and I bet a lot of the viewers are not. What percentage of American workers are unionized today, and how does that compare historically?
So in the 1950s, when we were young, and probably before a lot of the viewers are born, more than 1 in 3, 35% of workers were in unions. By the 1980s, that had fallen to about 22%, basically 1 in 5. And now we've fallen to just 1 in 10 workers are in unions and just 6% in the private sector. And basically among, the 35 leading industrial nations, we have the lowest percentage of workers in unions. And that has created, what I call in my book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, America's anti-worker exceptionalism. You were a reporter in Europe for a while, as I was, Clyde, and workers in Europe get guaranteed 4, 5, 6 weeks vacation a year. In the United States, we're the only industrial nation that doesn't have a law guaranteeing all workers paid vacation. We're the only country that doesn't have a law guaranteeing paid parental leave. We're the only industrial nation that doesn't have a law guaranteeing workers paid sick days or universal health coverage. So I think this stems in part from unions being weaker, and corporations, conservatives often talk about the importance of freedom, and they want corporations to have freedom to operate as they wish without mandates saying you have to do this or that for your workers.
To the degree, Steve, that we're seeing a rise in labor influence, does that translate into political influence? I mean, there was a time when unions obviously had huge influence in the elections, especially on the national level, in states like Michigan, states like Pennsylvania. I'm not so sure that's true anymore. But is that old phenomenon coming back to some degree?
That's a great question, Clyde. So I strongly believe that when Donald Trump won in 2016 and won the key states, the swing states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, that was in part because unions had grown weaker in those states, had lost a lot of members. And I've interviewed some labor experts who say that if the percentage of voters from union households in those three states had been 25 or 30% as they were 20, 30 years ago, there's no way Donald Trump would have won those states. Now, in 2020, Joe Biden was very popular among workers, among union members, and I think that helped flip Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania back into the Democratic column. But now, 2024, with inflation high right now, those states might very much be in play again. And unions, much more than in 2020 and 2016, I think they see that, hey, if we want to, elect a Democrat, if we want to elect a pro-worker, a candidate who's more pro-worker, pro-union than pro-business, we unions got to do a whole lot to make sure the Democrats win in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and also Georgia and Arizona and Nevada. So unions.
I'm sorry?
So unions, I've interviewed some union leaders, and they're worried, like many people, including New York Times editorial writers, about the decline of democracy in America. And they say we really have to step up to help save our democracy.
Fair enough. We only have a minute left. How much does the language of labor management relations come in? Usually stories say labor demands, management offers. Right away, there's a value judgment in both of those words. Is the very vocabulary of this a factor in, to borrow from Pete Seeger, which side are you on?
I think so. I think so. Absolutely. So one of the crazy things, I think one of the reasons the union won at Amazon Staten Island is Amazon, called the union organizers thugs, because that's what anti-union consultants, they often call, organizers thugs, like bully boys. But the people who are running the campaign in Staten Island, are current or former Amazon workers. They're African American. The majority of the workers at the Staten Island facility are people of color, and it really resonated very badly with them when the organizers, whom they liked, whom they knew, were called thugs. So sometimes the language used by companies, reflexively, can really backfire against them.
Well, there's a lot to unravel here, and wish we had more time. Thank you, Stephen Greenhouse.
My pleasure.
Next up, the state of dining in New York City. Welcome back. Dining out is a way of life in New York City, and it has come under severe strain in the age of COVID. Some restaurants have shut their doors, others have had to sharply change how they operate. Outdoor dining sheds are now part of our landscape, as you well know, though they don't please the eye, not by a long shot. Emily Weinstein is the Times' cooking and food editor and has been keeping a close eye on these developments. Plus, this weekend brings both Easter and Passover, holidays with distinct dining traditions. Welcome, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sidewalk dining sheds, are they here to stay, plain and simple, or are there moves to end them? A lot of them are obviously not exactly pleasing to not just the eye, but just to every sensibility there is.
Certainly, there have been many issues flagged about the dining sheds. Outdoor dining, I think, is here to stay, and the city is moving to formalize a program whereby you can apply for a license to have more outside seating. Okay. But my understanding is that the sheds themselves are not here to stay. Residents in neighborhoods are complaining, and there are just all sorts of issues with them. Rats also very unappetizing. So
yeah, they're not conducive to hearty appetite. Restaurants in general, do we have a fix on just how badly they've been hurt? Are there numbers that I'm not? I know you're not here as the economic person, but are there rough figures that we have on how many have shut down, what percentage, how much more difficult is it to run a restaurant now than it was? It seems to be stating the obvious, it's difficult, but how difficult?
I don't have the numbers at my
okay.
fingertips in New York City, and it's actually quite hard to assess those numbers in New York City. I will say that it is an immensely difficult time to run a restaurant. You have labor issues, well, obviously COVID to start, right?
Right.
Everything that has to do with public health and fear and safety. Restaurants run on such thin margins. I mean,
Even in good times, you mean?
in good
Yeah,
times, yes. So even in the best of times, the restaurant business is a very, very, very difficult business. And you have to manage the groceries you bring in, the food supplies in the restaurant. You have to ensure everybody is safe. You have to make sure your staff is safe. And it's just been incredibly complicated. So we've lost a lot of restaurants in the last few years. I think the restaurants that survived were the ones that were able to sort of marshal their regulars, marshal the fan base, and find a way to pivot to a delivery first model. Restaurants became grocery stores. Restaurants, I think, a lot of restaurants tried to feed essential workers and then receive donations in order to keep their staff employed and keep the place running until they could welcome guests back indoors again. And guests have been indoor dining in the city now for quite some time, but certainly it ebbs and flows with COVID waves.
I live on the Upper West Side, and certainly on weekends, but even midweek, but especially on weekends, restaurants are packed outside. I mean, usually with younger people. So I don't know if that's a citywide phenomenon or not, but it seems that at least in certain parts of the city, people want to support their local restaurants, I think.
Oh, a thing that COVID really made plain, at least from where I'm sitting, is how much people really love restaurants and how in a city like New York, it's just integral to the fabric of public life. And people were desperate to get back to restaurants. New York is a dining out town. It is, certainly there are several passionate home cooks here, but you move to New York and you want to take advantage of the restaurant scene, right? And people are dying to get back. And certainly outdoor dining has been massive. And there are restaurants who actually tripled or even quadrupled their seating capacity by being able to have so much outdoor space. So they were actually finding a way to thrive in the midst of all the chaos. Not to suggest it wasn't hard, but they managed to do it. Downtown too, restaurants are packed, just absolutely packed. I will say too, though, restaurants have reduced their hours. It's way harder to find a restaurant, that might have in the past been open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, to be open for those other meals. Now there's dinner, there's a set number of hours. They're probably not open 7 nights a week. I mean, we are seeing a reduction in the number of hours.
And is that because they're having trouble finding staff? And there's a restaurant, for example, in the Village where me and a bunch of fellow geezers like to gather on Tuesday. It has not been served for lunch, and it has just not been serving lunch during this whole period. So, because they can't find the workers.
A worker shortage has been an enormous problem, as it has, of course, throughout the economy. But worker shortage has been a big problem, and restaurants also always had high turnover, with labor. Not all restaurants, but most. It's an industry where people kind of do a stint, they move on to the next place. So couple that with labor shortages, and it can be pretty dire.
Have our eating habits changed during the last 2 years of COVID? Are we eating collectively differently than we used to, and perhaps not for the better, but maybe for the better, I don't know.
Well, you probably know the expression, eating your feelings. I think a lot of people ate their feelings for a time. And in NYT Cooking, so we have the food section at the Times, and we also have NYT Cooking, which is our recipe app. NYT Cooking, especially in those early days of the pandemic, just saw a surge of interest in the kinds of things you would expect: pantry recipes, beans, also projects, bread baking, all kinds of baking. People were at home, and food just provides a kind of comfort like none other for a lot of people. And also, frankly, there are a lot of people who just really couldn't cook very well. I mean, they could get by, but getting by is very different from cooking 3 meals a day. So we did have that surge of interest, and I do think that people, generally speaking, have continued to cook more. You know, as eager as people are to get back to restaurants, there are some home cooking habits that we believe have stayed with people. You know, which from my perspective is wonderful. I mean, I love to cook, and I find it really, really rewarding.
Are there national trends that basically track what we're seeing in New York, or are things different in Chicago, LA, Boston, wherever, or are we all in the same boat, basically?
Oh, you know, it really varies dramatically depending on the city's COVID response and sort of the mood in the air. So San Francisco is not so different from New York in terms of what's happened in restaurants there and COVID response and masking mandates. And whereas, you know, my colleagues who are based in the South, in Atlanta, New Orleans, people are not, you know,
they're not masking.
They're not masking,
right?
And they have not been there for some time. You know, the phrase people keep using it when they talk to me about it is, oh yeah, it's like COVID's not here. It's like it's totally done. And they've been saying this for more than a year.
I think, yeah.
So it really just depends on where you are. Los Angeles too, I think is more similar to New York and San Francisco.
We have major holidays upon us. Easter, Passover this weekend. We've been in the middle of Ramadan, and Iftar, the breakfast meal, is important. Are there trends in recent years we're seeing on what people do on these holidays that are different from the past, besides brisket or God knows what, and Easter ham or whatever it may be? I confess I'm not as familiar with Iftar traditions, but are we seeing new things?
I would say we're seeing cooks who celebrate these holidays looking to accommodate more different kinds of diets at the table. So, you know, and this is something we see for all the major holidays like Thanksgiving. You know, people write into us and they say, okay, my daughter is vegan, my son is this, I'm gluten-free, and my husband doesn't eat meat.
It's a nightmare.
It is. So we see a lot. We see a lot of sort of like the varied ways Americans eat coming to the table at these holidays, and people are I think trying to move away from meat in a lot of situations. Probably not for holiday centerpieces. You know, if you're somebody who's trying to eat less meat, whether that's for health reasons or you're concerned about climate change, you know, you might still have ham on Easter, right? But generally speaking, we see home cooks trying to figure out how to welcome everybody at the table and make sure there's something for everyone.
Does this lead to family arguments, perhaps, of, no, we're going to have a steak at dinner tonight, but you can't because I am now a fruitarian, and, or whatever it may be?
Well, family arguments are like one of the great holiday traditions, right? I think so.
Okay, fair enough. But are there more, I mean, is it more difficult to have a family meal than it used to be?
I think it is actually, you know, hopefully it's all in the spirit of love, but yeah, I think so. And honestly, I actually think it's probably more from the other side where people are like, you took away my stuffing? Like, that's my stuffing, you know?
I've been eating that stuffing since Grandma made it.
Yeah, you know, people are very attached to their food traditions around holidays.
Sure.
And there's something wonderful about that. But yes, you know, tensions rise, I think. You know, fortunately, I don't see that in my own family because we all kind of eat the same stuff more or less. So and I will say my family is not so big that you have a lot of variables. But as various children get older, I'm expecting we're going to see some shifts to accommodate.
What are you cooking these days?
What am I cooking these days?
You're a cook.
I am.
And I bet a great one. And, what are you doing these days?
Oh, thank you for asking. I have actually been trying to eat less meat, my husband and I, and so, you know, I'm cooking a lot with fish. I should say eat less red meat. I still eat meat, but I'm eating a lot of fish. I'm cooking a lot of beans and tofu. I'm cooking different proteins. I love to bake. I'm baking a lot. I'm baking more bread. You know, for me, I write a lot about home cooking as part of my job at the Times, and I'm always just looking for those brilliant recipe writers. I should say that too. I'm always cooking from Times recipes because I want to know what our reporters are looking at. I want to know what our recipe writers are doing.
Aren't they tested before they get
Absolutely. Very, very rigorously
Right. We're not-
tested and
I
edited.
assume.
No, this is sort of me, the editor, sort of poking around and saying like, I wonder how this one is, because I'm not personally, of course, testing them before publishing them. So I'm more of a reader in this situation, and I'll poke around and I'll see an ingenious use of an ingredient I don't use very often, or we have a few recipe writers who sort of in the vein of, say, Mark Bittman, are really, really brilliant at making things as simple as possible. And those are the recipes that really call out to me. I work full time, so I really want things to be brilliant and simple, but still delicious. Like I still want to eat good food at the end of the day. So
Sure.
that's what excites me.
I would hate to think that the food editor of the New York Times doesn't like to eat good food.
Wouldn't that be a scandal?
I think you should be a cover story in New York Magazine just for that alone. Thank you, Emily Weinstein, for joining us. And to all of you out there, happy Easter, Chag Pesach Sameach, and Ramadan Mubarak. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman.